you can go to my website, it's sudionart.com, and click on resources, and you'll find all the links there for everything that we have in this class. There's a link called coneflower sketch, and I've chosen to do this little coneflower painting with you because I feel it uses the most of the techniques that we're going to be learning. So I thought that would be interesting. It's one thing to learn the techniques, it's another thing to apply them in a painting. This is the chart that I've made up. This is a huge pad of really cheap watercolor paper, and I like to use an inexpensive watercolor paper when I'm doing exercises, just because I'm frugal to a fault. Although it's not going to work quite as nicely as my good paper. So there's that, you can make your own decision. We're going to try and go over 6 techniques every day. Some techniques I'm going to be demonstrating for you in a couple of different ways. When you pick up pigment, you never want to go from your little square here to your paper, because sometimes, especially if your paints are getting old, they'll begin to degrade. You can see these little bits of very dark color, and that is pure pigment. So you always want to go from your well of color to your mixing area and make sure that you've worked that pigment out a little bit. Also, as we begin in watercolor, we always want to keep our colors fairly thin. So to thin my color, I'm just going to add a little more water. We save these very thick applications of color for later on in the painting. But this is the same color, and you can see the difference in the hue just by the amount of water that I've added. But we do want to keep our colors fairly thin to start. And we're going to begin by doing something called wet into wet. And we're going to use our 3 primary colors. So we're going to be painting with yellow, red, and blue. Now, as a rule, you want to get in the habit of mixing your yellow first. Yellow is the weakest color in the spectrum, so it gets overpowered very easily. And the chances are really good that if you mix your blue or your red first, there's going to be a little bit of that left in your brush, and it's going to tint that yellow. So I'm making 3 puddles of color. A puddle of yellow, a puddle of blue, and a puddle of red. And I'm thinning those out a little bit. I might keep mine a bit thicker so you can see what's happening. But this technique, the first one that we're going to do, the wet into wet, I do this a lot as an underpainting. And we'll be doing an underpainting today as well. Now I'm going to take my big flat brush, and I'm just going to apply water to the board, or to the paper, excuse me. Now the way you apply your water, you want to dampen the paper, but you don't want so much water on there that it's dripping and running and you've got these big puddles of water sitting up on your paper. Remember that watercolor pigment goes wherever the paper is dry, or wet rather. So you want to wet that full square. And then applying the pigments, I'm just going to push a little bit of this yellow into here. Pick up some of my red, push that in, and I'm cleaning the brush between each application. And then I'm going to put in some blue. Now notice I'm not really painting. I'm just kind of dropping the color. I don't want to overwork it. Part of the reason for that is that if we take red, yellow, and blue and mix them all together, they will make a gray. So now I'm going to turn and tilt my paper, and I'm just letting those colors soften together. See how wet into wet gives us those beautiful soft edges? Up here, this is part of working on not very good paper. It just didn't accept the water evenly. So you can take your finger and run it over that. So I'm just going to take my brush, because this is really crappy paper, and I'm just going to push that around a little bit. But you can see the effect of wet into wet. All right. And I'm just going to let that dry. Looks like has everyone been able to do this? I can clean up the edge. This is a very dry brush that I'm using just to soften the color. When you're doing a wet into wet painting, especially an underpainting, you really want to see some of your original color and then some of the colors that get created by those original colors melding together. Now, watercolor pigment will fade up to 40% as it dries. So this will still be a nice underpainting when it's fully dry. So the next square is the graduated wash. And what a graduated wash is it's a wash that goes from dark to light. And we're going to do it very simply. I'm just going to use blue for this. And I'm just mixing up a little more of the blue. And what I'm going to do is take my big flat brush. I'm going to take the extra water out of it. I've just cleaned it. I'm going to pick up my color and lay a band of that color across the top of my paper. I might even come back and put a second, get a little more pigment up there.
I'm sorry. Excuse me, did you wet the paper first?
No, I'm painting on dry now. Good question. Thanks, Victoria. Once I've got that blue paint up there, I've cleaned my brush, I've taken out the extra water, and just with water, I'm going to soften that blue. I'm going to clean the brush again. Lay down a little more clean water and soften that blue. Whoa, sorry. Clean the brush again and just water. And my goal is to have something that goes from dark to light without any hard edges. Here with my second brush, I'll put a little more blue at the top. So this graduated wash is going from a dark value to a medium value to a light value to nothing. I'm going to turn my paper over and do the same thing in the opposite direction, starting with my heavy color. I'll just lay in some of that blue down here. Clean my brush and soften that blue. And then I can come back and pump in a little more color at the bottom. So these graduated washes, you will see quite often in like a landscape, because what happens is as the dark goes to the light and the dark goes to the light, our eye is drawn into the composition. It gives us a sense of depth. So understanding how to apply a graduated wash can be very helpful if you're trying to paint a landscape. You can kind of get the sense of being drawn into the painting. I guess this would be a better seascape than a landscape. If I wanted to do a landscape, I guess I would have put green down here. But I think you get the idea. And that is referred to as a graduated wash. I'm going to move you down to the plastic wrap. Go ahead and grab a piece of plastic wrap. Depending on how big your wedge is, you know, just grab a piece that's 6 or 7 inches long, I guess. But this time, I want you to use richer paint. So I'm mixing up a little more pigment and I'm making it darker. I'm using a little more pigment and a little less water. And I think I've got enough of my yellow, so I'm just doing the red and the blue. Maybe I'll put a little more yellow. Let's see how dirty it got. Not too bad. So you have your piece of plastic wrap ready. Put that under here. And you've got your red, yellow, and blue mixed up. A little more pigment this time. But I'm going to do the same technique. I'm going to put my yellow down in 3 or 4 different places. I'm going to clean my brush, take out the excess water, put down some red, and I'm working on dry. This time it's not wet underneath, it's dry, because I want these colors to stay nice and rich. And if I were to wet the paper first, they would thin out, and I don't want that. I'm putting all these colors down, and then I'm going to take my plastic wrap and I'm gonna lay it over the color and push it in. I'm squeezing it together and pushing it in. And then I'm just gonna leave that. We're doing something very similar to the wet and wet, except for two differences. We're not wetting the paper first. We're working on dry paper, and we're using richer color. You can see the deep saturation of the color here, as opposed to up on the wet and wet. So you can see some of the differences between what happens when your paper's wet and when your paper's dry. You don't get as many soft edges on dry paper, but it doesn't take the value out of your color. It keeps your colors a little bit richer. So you're going to paint your red, your yellow, blue on dry paper into the square that you've marked plastic wrap. And then you're going to lay your plastic wrap over it and just push it in with your fingers. And you're going to leave it. We're going to let that stay there until the pigment has dried. And at the end of class, we'll pull that off. I'm going to move into charging next. You don't even need a credit card for this one. And you can see I've got two little diagrams drawn here because I wanted to explain charging in two different ways. Although I kind of showed you the first one when we were doing the graduated wash. So I'm going to start there. I'm going to take some of the blue paint and I'm going to do a graduated wash kind of like I did up there, but on a smaller scale. The blue and then just water. Taking the extra water out of your brush when you're bringing that color down. And then I'll start at the bottom with my blue. I need a little more. Let's go purple. I've painted the color in. And then I'm just using water to soften that up. Charging is when you take color and put it into color. So here, remember when I stuck that extra pigment? That's charging. And that's one way that you may use charging to deepen a passage of color that you've already put in there. But you can do charging to edit a color, to say, oh, I wanted that to be a bit more green, so I could come in with that yellow. So charging is putting color into damp color. And you can see how, if I put this pink up here, you can see how the charged color will kind of creep in to the color that you've already put down. And that's because of the softness that happens when you're working wet into wet. I came back with the brush and kind of softened.